Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to Dashing Down Sporting Adventures for 2025. We've got a brand new sponsor. KISS Professional Solutions have jumped on board thanks to John McEncrow and the crew based in Carrum Downs in the southeast suburbs of Melbourne. And you can get them on 1300 KISS PS 547777 or their website www.kissps.com.au. They are the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria, with the largest small business in Melbourne, Sydney, Gippsland, Shepparton and Albury. And they offer business, phone systems, NBN services, CCTV and security systems. Now, if you're based or you live in Wagga Wagga, the team from Albury will come across and help you out with your situation in regard to what you might require for your own business, as I say, whether it be phone systems, NBN services, and they also take pride in going the extra mile for their customers, aiming to retain them for life. Whatever your office technology needs or might be, they're here to provide sound advice, competitive pricing, and unparalleled customer support. My guest today is a well-known sports broadcaster. He's got the greatest knowledge of anyone I know when it comes to sport. He's only 30 years old, but he knows everything. And we're talking about the test series between Australia and India. Some say it was the greatest of all time. Not sure about that. Certainly we've got the greatest crowd at the MCG for that test match, which had swings and roundabouts in regard to momentum shifts between Australia and India. Australia won the series quite comfortably in the end, 3-1. Damian Watson, welcome to Dashing Down Sporting Adventures.
Pleasure to be with you, Dan. And yeah, it's an interesting debate, isn't it, in regards to whether it's the greatest series of all time. I think there's a lot of Australians out there with a bit of recency bias and patriotism affecting their judgment in that respect. I don't think it's the greatest of all time. I think it was too one-sided for it to be the greatest of all time on paper. I know it was probably closer to what the scoreline eventually at the series, the end of the series, produced, but at the same time, I think we've seen closer, tighter series in the past.
Did ball dominate bat too much?
Oh, in certain instances, but we did see some good innings, didn't we? I think, we didn't see any instances where we had, or too many instances where we had a big innings of 500 plus, like we did when they came here, when the Indians came here in 03, 04. And that, there were a couple of beauties there. The Adelaide Test match, I think, is an underrated one from that summer, going back just over 20 years ago. But look, I would prefer a ball dominated. When I say ball dominated, a slightly more, I guess, a test series in which ball had a bit more of an influence the bat than an absolute road.
There are a couple of batters from each team that did well. Jais well, we'd heard a lot about him. A magnificent 100 in Perth and a couple of 80s in Melbourne. He ran himself out in the first innings and carried on a bit like a pork chop in the second when he was clearly out caught behind, even though the Snicko didn't register anything, but you could tell it was off the bat, but he batted pretty well. And Travis Head, when he goes. He's either all duck or no dinner, though, Travis Head. Had 3 innings in a row where it was 0, 1 and 4, but before that, 89 and 200s. But other than that, Steve Smith got some runs as well. There weren't too many others that shone.
It's true. I think there's still an issue in regards to the depth. That's always been the case, hasn't it? Where in the last 5 years, if Smith and Labuschagne haven't fired, you do question the consistency of the depth of the batting order. I still think Travis Head had a very good summer if you looked at it holistically. But, you go back 12 months, it was a completely different story, wasn't it, Dan? So I think he's an entertaining player all the same, though, and seems like a good bloke too, just to add to that. But, yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see what happens, the makeup of the top order going forward as well with Khawaja, and we'll discuss that as well. Khawaja didn't have a very good series, whether he stays in that Australian lineup, because, at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, isn't it, Dan? And he didn't necessarily step up. I know, he's got some runs on the board if you go back at certain instances where we thought his test career was over and he managed to turn things around when the question marks were on him, but the question marks are on him again.
Should have he made Sydney his last test? I think he should have. I think it would have been a nice way for him to bow out in his home city. I know that he moved to Brisbane about 10 years ago, at the same time Phil Hughes, the late great Phil Hughes, or the late Phil Hughes moved to Adelaide, and his career has certainly kicked on in Brisbane. I thought it would have been a nice time to go out because he'd shown, I thought, during the Indian series that his best was past him.
Potentially from a sentimental point of view, but I think he still feels that he's got plenty more to give. I think the decision might end up being made for him. I do wonder, though, they've got the series coming up in Sri Lanka, whether they try and blood someone else coming into the lead up to the Ashes summer next summer, or do they persist with him, given that Kawaja, he does have a tendency when he's back, if you look back at his career, when his back is against the wall, to stand out, particularly against those subcontinent teams. So I do wonder whether it's going to be a bit of a renaissance for him or whether they're hanging their hat on that. But if you want to look to the future, Dan, and you look at the average age of this Australian lineup, maybe it is time to blood a few youngsters in a series against Sri Lanka, in a series against the West Indies, or a player with lesser experience that can shine over the next 15 to 20 years, and they get their opportunity to do it now rather than in a big time series.
I know times were different, and when South Africa didn't come here in 71, 72 due to apartheid, and Don Bradman quickly organised the rest of the world team, captained by Garfield Sobers, to come out here, and a lot of players were not chosen. Bill Laurie, Graham McKenzie, and Redpath didn't have a great summer, and they were, I suppose, experimenting, looking ahead to the Ashes of 72, and picked Graham Watson, picked Ashley Woodcock, picked Bruce Francis, these sort of players, Ross Duncan, John Benno, to try and find the best players. Maybe they could do that with Sri Lanka and the West Indies. The World Test Championship coming up against South Africa in June. They probably would want to experiment then, but there are some players who I think aren't far away. Henry Hunter's one that I've been pushing for a while. He got back-to-back hundreds in the last two Shield games. Of course, they don't play any more Shield cricket till after the Big Bash, but he was one that was in form, and maybe he's worth a go. And I'd like to see McSweeney get another go, but probably not in the opening position.
Well, that's right. He's probably more suited to the middle order. And with Henry Hunt, I mean, yes, he came into the break with a fair bit of form, but holistically, I don't know, has he stood up with consistent runs over time? Probably not yet. So it does come down to that fact that we don't see as many players banging down the door. But I think is that going to be, Dan, probably a commonplace thing going forward where you don't have as much Shield cricket on a basis of continuity because you've got the Big Bash in the middle, and we're seeing a lot of players adopt more of a T20 style in their batting, and we've seen the evolution of the long format of the game reflect that. We're not going to see as many players bang down the door as much with big scores because there's just not the opportunity, or the evolution of the game is against that disciplined style of batting where you can stay out there for a long period of time.
Well, you're right. I mean, there are so many players nowadays who are looking ahead at the big money being offered by all the T20, even the 100 competitions that are now existing in England,
Yeah.
that are occurring around the world, and they're getting a power hitting coach in to help them play these improvised shots because they think they're going to be a better chance of playing in these tournaments and making big money quickly instead of learning the game properly in regard to having the right technique to play the longer form. And that's to me is a big concern. Being a purist, loving Test cricket ahead of all the other forms, I broadcast anything when it comes to cricket. I love the game that much, but when it comes to just watching, the one that I would watch if I had a choice would always be Test cricket.
Problem is, though, Dan, the younger generation, they want to see the T20, don't they,
I
really? I
do.
mean, it's a it's a bit different. I think in Australia there's still, and in certain parts of the world, there's still that appreciation of Test cricket. But if you look at cricket globally, Dan, we're seeing a bit of it in South Africa at the moment, where their schedule is being influenced a lot by the dominance of T20 cricket. Even though South Africa have made the World Test Championship final, we don't see as much of it. Look at the crowds; they're bloody sparse over
They
there.
are.
Every
They are.
time you see a shot of a South African home Test match, there's literally sometimes I wonder if there's anyone aside from two cats and a dog in the crowd. So I think you've got to cater for that fact that we're going to see more and more domestic pop-ups of T20 competitions around the world. That's going to narrow down the test schedule because you've got to fit, there's only so many months in the year. And, that's where the money is. So I think it's just a reality. I agree with you in the sense that I prefer test cricket as well because it's what we grew up with. But at the same time, players have got to earn their money while they can, and they've got to get the crowds in. And more often than not, they turn up to the T20 format. So it's just the way it is.
This is Dashing Dan Sporting Adventures, the first one for 2025. And you can get this podcast and all the other Dashing Dan Sporting Adventures podcasts on all the various social media platforms and also Spotify. And we're here for KISS Professional Solutions, based in Carrum Downs in the southeast suburbs of Melbourne. Offices also in Melbourne, Sydney, Gippsland, Shepparton and Albury, that also service offices in Wagga Wagga. They offer business phone systems, NBN services, CCTV, and also security systems. Whatever your office technology needs or might be, they're here to provide sound advice, competitive pricing, and unparalleled customer support with John McEncrow and the team. 1300 KISS PS or 547777, and the website www.kissps.com.au. Have we seen the last of Mitch Marsh, Damian?
Yeah, I think so. It'd be great to see him. When we thought about Mitch Marsh going out, bowing out before he had that renaissance in the Ashes series, of course. But look, it's hard to see him getting back in because he hasn't shown. I know he had that. He was close to getting a century in Boxing Day, the Boxing Day Test match in 2023 against Pakistan, but he just hasn't shown that consistency. I think there was almost, and it's very rare that you get universal appraisal when it comes to selection decisions, Dan, but I think you got the sense as well that most people agreed with the decision to put him out and put Bo Webster in. Bo Webster had been banging down the door at Shield level, not necessarily with big scores, but just with his general contribution because he provides so much variety and he deserved his go. There was almost universal appraisal with that selection decision, which doesn't happen too often, Dan, as we know.
Mark Waugh says Mitch Marsh is a great bloke, though, Damien. A great bloke. Michael Clarke, though, wasn't a great bloke, and he played a lot of Test cricket because he was a good player.
Stuart Law was a great bloke, but he didn't play a lot of Test cricket either for various reasons.
Steve Waugh didn't like him, and Ricky Ponting didn't like Brad Hodge.
Yeah, this is the thing. Like, there's always going to be that element of politics. We see it in most facets of life, don't we, Dan, in most industries. So unfortunately, it's a reality of human beings being together. But yeah, I just doubt whether we're going to see him come back in. There's just not that appetite unless he can have some sort of renaissance at domestic level. It is a bit of a shame in a way for him to go out that way, but at the end of the day, very rarely does a player go out on their own volition. So it's an interesting one. You mentioned great blokes. I don't know if we saw a lot of great blokes in the Indian team with some of their behaviour over the series in general. I just got the sense, Dan, I didn't mind a bit of the byplay between Virat Kohli and a couple of the others with Sam Constas because it made for great theatre. But I think just in general, their body language amongst themselves, the way they spoke to each other, the way they reacted when things weren't going their way, I just thought they whinged a bit too much. And as a result, they lost their focus out there on the field. I don't know if you got that sense, Dan, but that was something I just couldn't cop.
I think the head rots from the top, doesn't it? I think Gautam Gambhir is he's an interesting character, isn't he? He can be quite difficult. He can be cantankerous. He can be recalcitrant at times, for want of a better expression. He never seemed to be happy. He was blaming Sam Constas for getting ahead of himself when he should have been concentrating on the poor batting of his team. The impression I got was he got Richard Park not to play his natural game, and I know he played two terrible shots in Melbourne, and Sunil Gavaskar in particular, one of the greatest pieces of commentary we heard on the ABC, stupid shot, and he was right. But that's the way he plays, and it came off for a fair while in Sydney, and I still think that if he had another half an hour able to do what he was doing in Sydney, they might have had enough runs to defend. But then again, I still think they needed a fit Jasprit Bumrah, which they didn't have in the second innings in Sydney. He was the key, wasn't he?
Oh, no doubt about that. I reckon it would have been more of a one-sided contest had he not been around, and that includes the Perth Test match, to be honest with you. And it's an interesting one with the influence of Gambia as well. I think you're right. They needed to focus more so on their performance. I think as I said, I thought the byplay was very good for the series. It gets the eyeballs on the series, Dan. But I think they didn't do themselves any favours at all by focusing and whinging about things that they couldn't control. I mean, look at the situation with the DRS as well. I mean, They say, oh, you got to look at Snicko, and the technology says that there was no contact with the bat when it was pretty clear, even to someone who's 75% blind, Dan, that there was contact with the bat. that situation that I just didn't really understand. And I thought if the shoe was on the other foot in that instance, ultimately there would have been whinging and probably a cry of cheat, cheat, cheat from the Indians if it had been the Australians in that situation, just citing an example.
I mean, it was clearly out, and it was just that Snicko wasn't working, and the Indians then have the attitude that okay, well, Snicko's part of the DRS. If it doesn't show that there was an edge, it can't be out. But at the end of the day, it was definitely out. The Australians heard something, and they went up and they got their reviews right in Melbourne. The Indians, when they started panicking in that great partnership, and I don't think it's been given enough credit, Boland and Lyon, I was there with my son. It was excellent watching that last hour on Sunday and how much fight Boland had and how much fight Lyon had and how tired Bumrah was. And I reckon that's what's pushed him over the edge with the injury in the fifth test, trying so hard to get that last wicket when they had Australia on toast. And that obviously pushed the result well beyond what India could chase. But they had three howling DRS decisions for LBs that were clearly not out because you could tell that they were desperate. But Paddy Cummins and his team tended, or Cummins tended to get it right, didn't they, with their DRS reviews?
What are your thoughts, Dan, on the reception surrounding Pat Cummins? Because I still get the sense amongst the Australian, and it is a hard gig being an Australian captain because you're going to get criticism quite often throughout your reign and your tenure. But he seems to cop a bit of woke Pat, he's one of those people you can't have a beer with, blah 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 blah. And look, maybe to a certain extent, he does give off that perception, but at the same time, Dan, how often in the last 2 years has he dragged Australia out of trouble? And that includes a couple of instances in this series where they looked gone. And he's managed in both with the bat and the ball, managed to drag Australia out of the mire. I mean, I think he cops a bit of a bad rap. I know, he has his political statements and things like that, but he does cop a bit of a bad rap in the way that he goes about his cricket. He's made decisions against the grain that even a lot of former players and ex-captains have disagreed with that have proven to be right. You go back to that World Cup in 2023, that World Cup final, the call that he made with the toss, and certain instances where you think, oh, should he have declared at a certain time? Why did they continue batting early on day 5 in Melbourne? Well, they ended up being pretty decent calls in the end. So I don't know. Do you think we're a bit reactionary as a public towards Pat Cummins?
I think that he'd get a lot more heat if they weren't winning, but because they're winning, I think we accept who he is. Look, he's different. He is trying to change the perception of the Australian team. I mean, I thought Andrew McDonald went way too far with Sam Constas as well. And it again comes, I reckon, from the coach and the management to the captain. This is how we need to behave. And yet Sam Constas was, I think, biting off more than he could chew, particularly with trying to stop Bumrah from bowling because they didn't want to get an extra over in. They were happy to make that the last over on the first day in Sydney. And then Bumrah got the wicket and then said, well, there you go, son. And then Andrew McDonald has said, I hope he's okay. I mean, Sam Constance is fine. Yeah, look, it's an interesting debate, Damien. I think that he has a lot of views and maybe he has too many views, Pat Cummins, but you cannot criticise the way he plays. He leads from the front. He's got Australia out of trouble many times with the ball. And we know how handy he's been with the bat with some white knuckle knocks. That win in the first test of the Ashes in 2023, how good that was. He and Nathan Lyon batted beautifully together. So, look, he's a terrific cricketer and leads from the front. Whether he's the sort of captain that can come out and say things and fire his team up, I'm not sure about that. But I think he's the right leader at the moment. Who knows who the next leader's going to be and when that next leader comes in, whether they're going to be similar to Pat Cummins or whether they're going to go in the other direction a bit and leave out having views on what's happening in the world outside cricket. That's what lies ahead for us. But in regard to him as a cricketer, you cannot fault him because he's always performing and performing well. And who would have thought 13 years ago after he injured himself when he made his debut as an 18-year-old that he'd be close to 300 wickets and be virtually a bowling all-rounder and one of the best cricketers that we've had in this century.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's an interesting one with reactions. We'll touch on Sam Constant shortly, but I'm interested to know your thoughts because you've analysed the media and the public over a long time, Dan, and their reaction to certain things in sport. And I think maybe it's consequence of the social media age where we are a lot more reactionary. But coming into the series, I think there was a bit of, I wouldn't say cockiness about maybe the Australian fans, but I think a lot of people thought Australia would smash India. And then after Perth, there was almost a sense of crisis about the situation because they played so poorly for much of the Perth test. And a lot of people were calling for change. And yet things turn around very quickly. And I know it's human nature, but do you think as a public and as a media, there was too much of an overreaction? I know it probably helps the publicity of the tour, but when you think about it, there's a lot of outrage and a lot of conviction, probably over conviction of opinions very, very quickly based on results. It's a fickle world that we live in.
Damian Watson is my guest, by the way, and Dashing Down Sporting Adventures, well-known sports broadcaster and one of the great sporting minds when it comes to facts and figures in this great world of sport. And we're talking about the review of the Indian Australia Series. Australia won 3-1 for KISS Professional Solutions, the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria. Well, you're right. I mean, everyone was making comments saying that was a shocking performance. They had 2.5 bad days. Let's look at it like that. They bowled India out for 150. Good performance. Bowled well. Hazelwood in particular, outstanding. Then Bumrah just went berserk. Had a magnificent spell at Optus Stadium in Perth. And then the Australians were a bit flat. I think they weren't expecting India to do what they did with the ball and be leading by almost 50 runs. And they bowled badly. Rahul batted really well. We know how good Jazwal was. Kohli jumped on board the only time he has all series. And they batted okay in the back end of their, with obviously Travis Head getting some runs in the second innings. But at the end of the day, they probably hadn't played enough cricket, some of them. And they were just a bit flat. Enough red ball cricket anyway. So I think that a few of us were looking for change. I certainly was. I thought it wouldn't be a bad idea if you brought in some youngsters, even though they were only 1-0 down in the series. But full credit to them. They said that these guys have got us to where we've been for the last few years, a pretty strong team. They've had one bad test. They deserve an opportunity to try and improve the situation. And they stood firm, and their bowling in particular just got better and better. And India's batting, which was a real problem, bar that second innings in Perth, never got any better, did it?
No, exactly right. And that's probably going to be the test for them going forward. And it's been probably found out a bit in that series against New Zealand and then again in this series against Australia. So it's interesting some of the friction between some of the players as well. Do you think there'll be change from an Indian point of view also, Dan, going forward off the
Well, I think
back of the last two test series?
I think Sharma's gone. I think Kohli should retire. Ravi Ashwin's retired because Gambier didn't want him anymore, and I think he's thrown the toys out of the cot. I'm not sure about Sudman Gill. He just seems to be horribly out of form. Not quite. He's getting a few starts, but not going on with it. Particle showed a bit in the second innings. He missed out in the first innings. Giral showed a lot of the Australia A, India A matches. Maybe they try and persevere with him. It's an interesting one. I think that they lack a little bit of depth. Darren Lehman made a very in their batting interesting point that they've got 3 number sevens when they were going okay in Melbourne. In Reddy, you got 100, and then he fell away in the last 3 innings. Washington, Sundar, and Jadeja. None of them are number 6s yet, and that's a bit of a worry when you've got 3 number 7s. And if they batted 7, 8, 9, you then got a bit more depth because the tail is very, very long, as you saw certainly in Sydney and to a lesser extent in Melbourne with Bumrah and with Siraj and a couple of others who are deep who played in Melbourne, and they just showed that their batting fell away badly. So I don't quite know what they do with their number 6 position at the moment, or whether they just persevere with Reddy or they just persevere with Jadeja at 6. And even Pant at 5 to me is a bit high. So that's the big worry they have at the moment. When Sharma and I think we've seen the last of him and Kohli go, are those players like Particle and Giral going to be able to step up quickly? I'm not sure they will straight away, which is a major concern for them. And as we've said a few times, Damo, they rely on too few. We know that Siraj took 20 wickets, but Bumrah took 32 and was the star of the series for them. If he had have broken down earlier in the series, there's no way they would have been able to stay in test matches like they did because of him.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think they relied too much on Bumrah when you look at it in retrospect. I do think, though, it was interesting the point you make about depth, and I think you're right. They do lack a bit of depth in the batting department. I think there will be enough depth going forward, though, if you look at their system, their first class system at the moment. And we saw going back to 2020/21, they probably had a bit of a third string side that beat Australia on Australian soil. It does
Yes.
show that there holistically is a fair bit of depth there. I think they can recover it. Yeah, there's that much interest surrounding cricket, so yeah, they're going through a bit of a rough patch at the minute, but I think they will turn things around, at least in my point of view, anyway, because they just froth at the mouth over it.
Oh, they do. I mean, you only had to see the crowds, 87, 85, 83, first 3 days in Melbourne, down a bit Sunday, 43, which was pleasant. Great being there with my son. I saw a terrific atmosphere. And then 74,000, they opened the gates on the fifth day and they were raising money for some of the grassroots programs in cricket, which was wonderful. And it was the only test that really went the 5 days. Are you a fan of 5 day test cricket, or Michael Vaughan's been pushing for 4 day test cricket?
Only a fan of 5 day Test cricket. I
So
think
am
even
I.
Michael Vaughan admitted himself during the Melbourne Test that he had one of those winking emojis on Twitter or X or whatever it's called, Dan, and made a bit of a drive-by comment at himself almost. Because what's the harm in having that fifth day anyway? You allocate 5 days. If it gets done earlier, it gets done earlier anyway. If it gets done within 4 days, then so be it. So I don't know. Does it actually make that much of a practical difference if you push it to 4 days? I just think if you got that fifth day in reserve in case there's raid, or imagine if we had only the 4 days for the Melbourne Test, it would have been an anticlimactic finish and we would have been begging for more. So I really don't see why there's a push, from my point of view anyway, to condense it to 4 days. If you got the 5 days allocated and it finishes earlier, so bloody be it.
Well, the Test Championship of cricket between South Africa and Australia. And South Africa, by the way, not playing any more Test cricket until then and don't have any Test scheduled at home next year at this stage. I don't know what's going to happen there. But Australia, of course, as we've said, got Sri Lanka and then the West Indies still to come before that Test Championship final in England. It's the sixth day if required, plus a rest day if one of the days has rained out. Now, I wonder whether that's too many. I mean, there were years gone by. The last of the timeless tests I remember was Australia and India, 1978 in Adelaide. That was a timeless test of which India were chasing a massive total of well over 400. Didn't quite get there, and Australia ended up winning that series 3-2 under Bob Simpson. But then, of course, they got rid of the
Yes.
timeless test format. But I wonder whether they've gone a bit too far with that in regard to the Test Championship, because I think if Australia are on their game, with the greatest respect to South Africa, whose batting is still a major concern, their bowling's good if they're all fit, particularly Rabada and Jansen, an outstanding opening pair. I think that Australia will win that test and win it quite comfortably.
Maybe just to that point in regards to the scheduling, maybe they just see it as a bit of a novelty in case there is a fair bit of England rain, Dan, and they've got that in reserve potentially. I reckon that might be in the thinking there. You're right about South African cricket, though, and where things are heading. And they've got a pretty good team. They've had, I wouldn't say a renaissance, but they've improved from where they were. They were in probably the worst position they've been in post-apartheid about 4 or 5 years ago
Yeah.
when they were getting beaten by Sri Lanka and the West Indies, etc. But if you don't schedule a lot of Test cricket, and you've got to remember too, there's no interest. It seems like there's no interest in Test cricket over there anymore. The crowds are terrible. It seems like rugby union's always been their dominant sport, Dan. But I don't know. I'm not there. I'm not on the ground, so I can't make an effective judgment. But I do worry about the status of cricket. I suppose they're more focused on the T20 format, but the status of cricket over there in South Africa compared to various other sports.
They've won 7 of their last 8 tests. Now, Bavunga done a great job as captain. I didn't think he was a good enough player to be in the team, but I think being the captain has made him a better player. His average is now approaching the high 30s, which is steady, which is solid. That's what Dean Elgar average as a test cricketer throughout a very long career, around 38 as an opener. So he certainly got better. And we know Rabada and Jansen are outstanding, and Bosch showed a bit, and Patterson showed a bit, and Varenya's made runs. But again, it's just their top order to me is still a work in progress. So I wanted to ask you about Scotty Boland, outstanding. Could he play to 40 like James Anderson? Hasn't played as much cricket as some of the others, and we see Josh Hazlewood starting to almost come to an end. He turns 34 on January the 8th, the same day that I turned 56. Gee, I'm getting old. And the great Lawrence Rowe of the West Indies celebrating a birthday as well, one of my favourite players, and the late Elvis Presley and also Adam Good. So it's a great day for birthdays outside me, Damo. But Josh Hazlewood getting on a bit. But Scott Boland's 2 years older than him. In fact, he'll be 37 later in the year. Could he play till 40?
Potentially, he hasn't experienced as much of a load as Hazelwood has in recent years, which might work to his advantage. I think as long as he's fit and firing, absolutely he can. He's very effective. I think it's predicated on the conditions he's confronted with. We know he loves bowling at the MCG. We know the SCG pitch in general wasn't great, but it suits his style of bowling, as we know, because he gets that movement, that late in swinging out, swinging movement, can turn it around, can change it up with that variation, that subtle variation. I think he can continue. And we're seeing greater durability amongst athletes globally, aren't we? Not just in cricket. So if he stays fit and firing, absolutely he can do a Bob Holland and play at the age of 40.
He's been outstanding. I mean, the way he's been bowling just in Sydney, and I thought that wicket wasn't a great wicket. I mean, I looked at it the first couple of days and thought, gee, it looks exactly like the infield next to it and even the outfield. That was how green it was in the first 2 days and certainly favouring the bowlers. But he hardly bowled a bad ball bowling. He just was bowling metronomically like Glenn McGrath. And he's just got better and better the older he's got. I mean, you could have had any money you liked 5 years ago that he was going to play for Australia and play an important role like he is now at the age of 36, almost 37.
Well, he's got that cult status as well, which always helps. The public love him, even though he's not a very flamboyant character. It's amazing how the public sort of have become attached to him as well. I know the Boxing Day 2021 Test exploits helped that, but yeah, I think you're right in regards to it's a good word you use as metron. He is a bit like a metronome in the way that he goes about it because he's so consistent in the way he can just power on as well. And that's probably an underrated facet of his game too. We know he can strike and strike quickly, but he can go and go and go all day too, which is what you want. You want that stamina, you want that endurance. So yeah, I think he can continue, Dan, as long as it's always a results-based game, a results-driven game. So I think he can continue going forward. Just going, and I wanted to touch on this and particularly get your thoughts because we're of two generations, Dan. We go from an elder statesman age-wise like Scott Boland and go to the youngster and Sam Constas. What were your
Yes.
thoughts on his demeanour at times to the Indian players, the ramp shots, the extravagance, the youthful exuberance, the arrogance? I mean, Usman Khawaja even declared him as arrogant, but a likable arrogant person, something like that. He was quoted as saying. What are your thoughts? Are you getting a bit ahead of himself?
I think he certainly is. I thought you were referring to me and yourself as the elder statesman and you being the young buck, which is probably the way to go. But you're certainly not arrogant like Sam is. Look, good luck to him. He's gone out there and he's decided I'll ram shot Bumrah, and it worked. And he's stepped down the ground a couple of times, and he's run up to him and he's danced down the wicket, and it did work in making that 60. But he played that horrendous shot in the second innings in Sydney. People might say, "Gee, Dan, you're a negative individual," or words to that effect. But you've got to know your place a bit. And I thought, okay, there was some gamesmanship there. He was determined that they weren't going to have another over, and he stopped for Usman Khawaja, and Bumrah was nearly through his run up, and then probably Bumrah doesn't need. He's got the wicket of Khawaja. He laughs loudest, Damo. So he didn't need to say Bumrah to Constance because they'd got the wicket. They'd got what they needed, even though they'd been forced to slow down in that last over. They still got a wicket before stumps. So that was silly by the Indians. He did okay then, Constance, if his job was to get them riled and fired up. But I think at the moment that he's a bit too cocky. Okay, he's 19. Good luck to him. That's the way this generation is nowadays. You can't stop us from doing anything. But I still think you need to know your place. And as Alan Border said, and David Boone said, and all those players when they first played for Australia, they didn't say anything unless they were spoken to. You just sat in the corner And I'm not saying that he's like that in the dressing rooms. We don't see that. But you saw out in the ground how positive he was. When wickets were falling, he was very demonstrative, particularly when there were a couple of decisions that were referred to DRS in Melbourne. Okay, good luck to him. And it might take him a long, long way, and that confidence could see him have an outstanding career in a very short space of time. But if he continues to act like that and he doesn't get runs, there's a lot of media that cover cricket. They'll be putting him in his place, especially ex-players.
Well, I can understand the ex-player's point of view. I think the media can be a little bit hypocritical, though, Dan, when it comes to that sort of thing. And you're right, it's a fine line. You don't want to step over that line and rile the opposition up to the point where they get motivated to smack the bejesus out of the opposition themselves, And that was the point Mark Taylor made. You speak of ex-players, and I think it was a pertinent point that he made in that you don't want to give the opposition motivation to have a crack back at you and fire them up because they'll just respond twice as hard. Having said that, just in regards to the media reaction to him, I mean, they loved it and lapped it up when he made that 60, as they should. It got eyeballs on the game. It was very entertaining. That's what you want. But I think they're very, very quick, the media, to shout down on him as well when things aren't going his way. And I know it's a fickle industry, and I know and the public can be very fickle as well. But how long, for the last 10 to 15 years, particularly in Australia, Dan, have we been crying out for a bit of personality because we've seen players get a bit gun shy, they're a bit robotic. We don't see the same flamboyance. That was the thought process, wasn't it? We don't see the same flamboyance as some of the great larrikins and characters of the past in Australian sport. Now that we're seeing a bit of Gen Z flamboyance now in both footy and cricket and various other sporting codes. Now all of a sudden, you're stepping out of line. We don't want you to do that because you're getting ahead of yourself. It's that bit of that tall poppy syndrome element as well. Well, isn't that contradictory to what we were begging for only 5 or so years ago?
But then, Damo, isn't that the plethora of media, like you and I? And there are others who have higher profiles, with the greatest respect. That this is their living. They've got to be making comments each day about what's happening in the game, good or bad. So
I don't think you can contradict yourself, though, in that sense where I'm not.
We do. I mean, when I do my report every week, and it's very minor on Facebook page, I'll be critical of on the AFL. I might praise one side one week and be critical the next week. I mean, it's on what you've seen. I mean, at the end of the day, if you are going to argue a point, now I'm a great fan of the way Gerard Whateley can argue a point and then get people on his side and have them believe everything he said. He's so good at doing that. He did that after the first test. I thought, gee, you're going a bit early, Gerard, but the way you've argued the point, so many people jumped on board. Now, I didn't hear enough of what he said when Australia got themselves back into the series and ultimately won quite comfortably 3-1, whether he changed his tune very quickly. Now, you're right. We're all hypocrites if we jump from one angle to the other. But because there's so many people in the media and you've got to write stories, you've got to provide material for social media, you're on the radio, you're on the television, you basically have to say what's in front of you. If you keep if Gerard all along has said, I still think they need to make change, they've fought back well, but I still think they need to make change, that's fine. But then again, if you jump and completely say, well, those who said that Australia were ordinary in the first test and needed to completely rearrange their test side, it's a nonsense compared to what's happened now. But that's what we tend to do in the media, because at the end of the day, we've got to make opinions, and we generally make opinions of what we've just seen, if you know what I mean.
I agree in regards to assessing performance, because we can only judge what we see. You're right, and that changes from week to week. And I think there's merit in absolutely changing your opinion based on a change of performance from a team or a player. It was more about, and I'm not picking on anyone in the media necessarily, it's more of a pluralistic thing, both with the media and probably the Australian population as well. I've always been critical of the whole tall poppy syndrome element that seems to creep in my view, in Australia. But it's more about targeting players who show a bit of personality. You know, I would have thought we liked larrikins, and I know you don't want to go overboard and rile the opposition up, but at the same time, we've been crying out for personality. We hate the robotic element of sports people. Not hate it, but it gets bums on seats when we have a larrikin, when we have someone who's very, very flamboyant. And I reckon that was missing for a long period of time in sport until the new Gen Z crew have come in and changed things. And in my view, to a degree, for the better, because it gets far more attention when you play an entertaining brand of either footy or cricket or whatever sport you're playing, and you show a bit of flair to it as well. I mean, we saw that from players in various sports in the 1980s, and now we're seeing it again in a different way with the Gen Z. I agree with the media and with the public when they change their tune on performances, because you go by what you see, but personality is personality, right? So that's where I have a problem with the contradiction.
This is Dashing Dan, Sporting Adventures. Damian Watson, well-known sports broadcaster, is with me. We're talking about the series that's just ended. Australia beating India in the cricket 3-1. They dropped the first test. They won 3 of the next 4 and probably on the way to winning in Brisbane as well, which was ruined by rain. We're here for KISS Professional Solutions. 1300 KISS PS 547777. They're the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria. They're based in Carrum Downs, also in Sydney, Gippsland, Shepparton and Albury, and they service the Wagga area. They offer business, phone systems, NBN services, CCTV and security systems. They take pride in going the extra mile for their customers, aiming to retain them for life. Whether your office technology needs or might be needing material or new technology, they're here to provide sound advice, competitive pricing and unparalleled customer support. Go and see John McEncrow and the team. Yeah, it's a fascinating point you bring up. And the media, though, we're all in it. We're all trying to find a story. We're all trying to make comments. But I think that at the end of the day, Cricket Australia would be delighted with the amount of interest that this particular series has created. Whether we get the same amount of interest for the Ashes, do you think we will? Or do you think the crowds won't be anywhere near as big overall as we got, especially in Melbourne, Damien?
It's a good question. I think there will be that interest. I mean, we're coming off the back of a good summer interest-wise here, and also the 2023 Ashes, Dan. I know it probably seems like a lifetime ago now, but remember how much interest was involved there, because we had a pretty good series where it was going to and fro, and it dominated the papers and dominated the media even over there in England, which hasn't always been the case in the last 15 years when it comes to the way the public receive cricket in England. So the 2023 Ashes series was a very entertaining one, and it had that spice with Bazball, with the Bairstow dismissal, etc. So I think, and this is, remember, also probably the first time in quite a while where we're going to have the maximisation of crowds, because the 21-22 Ashes series here was affected by the whole COVID thing, because we were just coming out of COVID and coming out of the lockdown. So, and you got to remember too, Dan, even when it was a one-sided series in 2013/14, the highest, and still to this day, if you even include the recent Boxing Day test, the highest ever crowd for a day of test cricket was recorded in Boxing Day 2013, when the series was virtually already over, when they got over 91,000. That was for an Ashes test. And
I remember
that is always going to be part of history.
Yeah, I remember seeing Paul Sheehan, the then president of the MCC, on the second day of that test match, former Australian player. And we looked down, we're up just outside the media centre, and we looked down on the Percy Beams bar, which is a good bar to be, but you can't see the cricket. You're out the back there, overlooking Yarra Park. And he said that bar was heaving yesterday, Dan. It's not quite as busy today, but still pretty busy. But you wouldn't have been able to move in that bar yesterday. That's how busy it was. And he said it was an incredible crowd. And you're right. I think Boxing Day will be like that next year, because we are expecting a pretty good series. We know England are a fairly good side. Brooke and Root are great players. Duckett's become a good player. I think they've got an issue with Crawley. Stokes' body, it'll be interesting how that is in the back end of what's been a great career. He's played a lot of cricket, and they're bowling. Obviously, Atkinson is a good player now. Cass has come on over the last 6 months or so. They've got a pretty good side, England, haven't they? So I think they'll take it up to Australia, and this Australian team will be 1 year older.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think there's still that element of an undercurrent of rivalry. Well, there was the rivalries there anyway, but even in recent times with the verbal spats between both sides. So I think there'll still be that interest. There's no question about that. You could even argue greater. But it's interesting. I think the Ashes still has the number one mantle in terms of great cricketing rivalries that are played on a regular basis. But it's amazing how the Australia v India series has risen in terms of its standing, Dan, because for a long time, India didn't come here all that frequently.
They
It's
didn't.
probably only really been the last 25 years that they've come here on a 4 yearly basis, haven't they? So it's amazing how that's risen over time.
Well, that's right. I mean, they came here in 67, 68, and then not again for another 10 years, 77, 78, and then 80, 81 for a three-test series. The only three tests that Greg Chappell, Dennis Lilly, and Rod Marsh, who played a lot of test cricket between them, played against India. And then we didn't see them again till 85, 86, and then that memorable series when there was the tie in 86. And then there was, 91, 92. So you're right, it was intermittent. But then the last 25 years, we can't get enough of them. And of course, in the early part of this century, they had that great top six. But the batting is just not as good as it was. What's your view on Jasprit Bumrah? Ian Botham says he's the best fast bowler he's ever seen. He, of course, has been here for the last two tests of the series for Triple M, commentating the cricket. We know he's one of the greatest cricketers we've ever seen, but he thinks Bumrah's the best fast bowler he's ever seen, and he's played against some of the best and seen some of the best.
Yeah, I wouldn't rate him as number one. I think there's been some quick bowlers that have been more intimidating. And I think in terms of general bowlers as well, I still rate Warney as number one because he dig his side out of a hole. He was durable and probably would have got more wickets had it not been for suspension and also injury over time. But Bumrah would have to be in the top five in my view. He's got that unique style. He can take wickets very, very quickly. He's not in terms of his mannerisms, he's not necessarily intimidating, but by geez, bowling's intimidating as well. And he's probably, and it's very rare that you see a bowler create a bit of an evolution on their own 2 feet in regards to the way they go about it. And I know he's got a unique style, but he's sort of allowed fast bowling to evolve through his own style. And you don't see that. That only comes across once in a generation. So yeah, he'd have to be up there in the top five, I reckon, for efficiency and the way he dismantles sides very, very quickly. And some of those full deliveries and the movement that he creates as well, absolutely superb. So he'd have to be in the top five, in my view.
Are you worried about his body? I worry about the action, not whether it's illegal. I did ask Ian Botham this in an interview I did with him down at Mount Eliza Cricket Club before Christmas. And I said, you worried about his action? He said, what's wrong with it? You know, he quickly defended him. I said, oh, nothing in my mind, legality wise, absolutely not as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's interesting the way he delivers the ball and the wrist movement, the way he cocks the wrist, etc., looking to work out which way the ball's going to go. He's a genius like that. I'm more worried about his back and about parts of his body, not so much his run up, but just the way he puts so much effort into his back and his rotator cuff to generate the pace. That's what I'm worried about, short term and long term, that he may not have the career. He's had a pretty good one so far, but he may not have the career that he deserves to have because of that very interesting bowling style that he possesses.
It's a fair point you make, I think. The other element is, well, is it just a natural movement, of his body that, some players can cope with that sort of thing. Very rarely. Seen a lot of players, particularly fast bowlers, certainly go under with the demands of cricket and their body breaks down. But unless he has, and you're right, it's probably inevitable that does happen. Well, it happens to every player, doesn't it? But I think if it's just a natural part of his motion, and it's amazing. I'm not a biomechanics expert or anything like that, but it's amazing if the body does get used to it and adapts. You don't feel the same level of pressure because it's just an inherent part of your action. Maybe that works in his favour to a positive degree, but I don't know. I do wonder whether they've had a biomechanics expert to go in and try and, I guess, address little nuances in his action as well, so that he doesn't overdo it.
No, that's exactly right. But we just hope that he can keep playing because I just love watching him. I just cannot take my eyes off him watching him bowl. He's just absolutely sensational. When he was bowling, you just
I think
hope that
number
he
one for you.
perform well. Oh, yeah, I think so. I love DK. DK was a magnificent bowler, but I think he's number one. I mean, there's a smaller body of work from him, 45 tests. Dennis Lilly played
Yeah.
70. Glenn McGrath played over 100. I'm talking fast bowlers. Bourne's the best I've ever seen. But in regard to bowling, but fast bowling, DK's right up there. But Bumrah's nearly with him now. And Wasim Akram's another outstanding bowler. Waqar Yunus, Imran Khan, Kapil Dev carried India for a long time. He was a terrific bowler. Richard Hadley, I mean, there's some great bowlers, and I think Bumrah's probably better than all of them. And it's just a smaller body of work, which might just, if he doesn't play as much as the others because of injury, it'll probably put him back a bit. But watching what he does at the moment is just absolutely fantastic, and it's a privilege to watch. Before I let you go, and of course, Damian Watson has been my guest for Dashing Down Sporting Adventures, reviewing the series between Australia and India. For KISS Professional Solutions, the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria. They've got offices in Melbourne and Carrum Downs, also in Sydney, Gippsland, Shepparton and Albury. And whatever your office technology needs may be, they're here to provide sound advice, competitive pricing and unparalleled customer support with John McEncrow and the team. Should Steve Smith be captain in the absence of Pat Cummins in Sri Lanka as he's staying home for the birth of his second child? We wish him and his wife all the best in that venture. Or should they look at someone like a Travis Head? I'd have Travis Head.
Yeah, in my view, I could only say this from the outside looking in because I always believe that the best judges are those within the four walls of the inner sanctum because you can have a perception and you can have a public profile in which you conduct yourself a certain way, Dan, and then you're very different behind closed doors. But having said that, just from the outside looking in, I'd probably have Head on top as well because he seems like a good bloke. He seems like his cricket knowledge has developed quite masterfully over time as well. He seems to have a very good temperament about him, which I think is important as a captain. Having said that, I'm not necessarily against, and I know people will bring up sandpaper game, but I'm not necessarily against bringing Steve Smith back into that role temporarily. I think a lot of water's gone under the bridge since then. I think he, more than anyone else, would have learned his lesson from that particular episode as well. And he has the experience under his belt too, from a leadership point of view, and the players do look up to him. So I don't see it as much of a big deal as maybe others would in regards to him having the captaincy. Again, I'm with you in that I'll put Head ahead of him, but I'm not in opposition to Steve Smith having that mantle.
I think he's had his chance. I've never thought of him as a great skipper. And I think it's very hard to forgive him for what happened in Sandpaper Gate, where he just sort of stepped back and didn't want to take much responsibility for it. I know it's a long time ago, and I know people might think, gee, Dan, you're a hard taskmaster, and you've made a lot of mistakes yourself. I certainly have, no doubt about that. You're always looking for forgiveness yourself, but I just think it would be a good idea to see if Travis Head's made of the right stuff, which he's shown, I think, at Shield level and domestic level for South Australia, that he might eventually take over from Pat Cummins. One more question. You think there'll be two spinners playing in Sri Lanka? Who will play with Nathan Lyon? And will they take three as a backup?
Oh, it's a good question, isn't it? Oh, well, I don't know. Do we have the depth to have three? That's the question I have because I'm not sure if we necessarily do at the minute. We don't have necessarily. I reckon you have Lyon and Murphy in there, but I'm not sure if we have enough depth to create. And I know you got Lloyd Pope trying to develop his skills. He's still relatively young in the grand scheme of things,
Long
but
way away.
do
Long
we
way.
have? Yeah, he's a long way away. Certainly, I'm not suggesting he comes in any way, shape, or form, but and I know he's probably more of a big bash contributor than he is in the red ball format. But I don't know if we're seeing anyone necessarily banging down the door in that respect to take that third spot.
Well, certainly, as you say, Todd Murphy. Kuhneman has played a couple of tests, but he hasn't done much since, has
Yeah,
he?
true.
Swepson, to me, hasn't done enough either. They're talking about
Not
Rochester
in recent times.
Perth, but I still think it's a bit early yet for him. I'm not convinced he's done enough. Agar is a good shield cricketer. He doesn't get enough wickets. So we've seen the left armers over the years be good containing bowlers. Paul Harris at South Africa, Ray Bright at Victoria after World Series cricket. He played 25 tests for Australia. Xavier Doherty was a good shield cricketer, but again, he didn't get a lot of wickets. The left armers, to me, don't tend to be wicket-taking bowlers, especially at the highest level. And I think Agar's been tried a few times without much success. Michael Beer's another one. So, yeah, even though I think they like him as a cricketer, I don't think he's the sort of player we need. I mean, maybe Zampa might have been the one, but he's concentrated on the Big Bash and he hasn't played enough red ball cricket. But again, and we've said this before, Mitch Marsh is a good bloke, Damian, and that's why I think they liked him in the team. But at the end of the day, he didn't have the full Michael Clark, wasn't a good bloke, but was such a good player, he stayed in the team. I'm not sure that Zampa is the right sort of character to be in the team all the time. I know he plays T20 cricket, but again, it's all about being able to mix in the dressing room, which again, I think is wrong. If you're good enough to play, it doesn't matter who you are, you embrace that character. We're all different. We've all got different skills to bring to the table. If you're good enough to play, good enough to perform, you should be chosen, shouldn't you?
Yeah, I think you're right. Having said that, as we saw with Dean Jones, and I know that was addressed in recent times because I think it's the 30th anniversary, Dan, where his non-selection probably dominated cricketing discussion even more so than what was happening on the field. You know, he caused a bit of tension apparently in the dressing room, but we know he probably deserved to be out there when you look at the cricketing style of things as well. So there's a line you can't cross before you wreck the culture of the place. But just in regards to Swepson, I know you mentioned his name. If it had been at a different time, maybe he would have been in the conversation, but he hasn't produced that same form that he produced during the COVID summer where he took 40 wickets. And I know he's had his injury travails because he had that bad neck injury, but he probably hasn't shown enough in recent times.
Well, Damian, great to catch up. We're going to be doing this regularly. We will do a preview of the AFL season, preview of the NRL, see if Penrith can continue their mighty run. What a great team they've become in recent years. We know Melbourne Storm are a great side as well, and whether some of the bottom teams like Parramatta and West's Tigers can improve. And we'll also review the Australian Open tennis, which gets underway soon. We're here for KISS Professional Solutions. We thank John McEncrow for jumping on board. 1300 KISS PS, 547777 is the phone number, or the website is www.kissps.com.au, and you can catch this podcast, Dashing Down Sporting Adventures with the great Damian Watson, on all your various social media platforms, including Spotify. Thanks, Damo, and we'll catch up again soon.
Always a pleasure.